Hello, and welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I'm laughing. I'll explain why in a moment. I'm Brandon Testers. I am a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for many, many reasons, not least of which is because it's a public stream and I'm just talking out into the ether. But the structure of this, as always, every week, is that it's an open conversation. Any of you that are here and want to put something in the chat, questions, comments, anything, I am impacted by you. You'll be impacted by me. I'll think of things. You'll think of things because of something I do. I'll think of things because of something you do. It's a conversation. That's what it's meant to be, not a series of webinars or lectures. Although we do always pick a topic, kind of, to talk about, just to get things going, because that way there's no pressure for somebody coming in to just sit there and look at me sitting silently, which, by the way, weaponizing silence is one of my least favorite things that most therapists are taught to do, and teachers for that matter. Anyway, so we're going to talk about some stuff. And what we talk about is going to be based on what happens with the other portions of the conversation, not just me, the other participants, you guys. So if you're on Twitch, this is just a general reminder that if you post something while you're watching it on Twitch in the chat, then it will give your Twitch name. If on Facebook, it'll give your Facebook name. If on YouTube, it'll give your Google account that you're logged in with. If privacy is an issue for you, you can always create an account on Twitch that doesn't use your real name, or create a fake account on one of the others. That way we can chat without you having to worry about being connected to you. Although I do also try not to say people's chat names out loud, generally speaking. So we've got an hour to chat. And I laughed earlier. I said I would explain it because this is the first time I've ever done this for the stream, which is I went straight from what I was doing prior to this into the stream. Didn't even have a moment to run to the restroom or start some tea, which I usually drink during the stream, or even refill my water glass. So at some point during this, I have a decanter over there for just such occasions with water in it, and I will fill up my water glass out of that. This is very common for me, and it's common for a lot of people who are neurodivergent, particularly ADHD. People might refer to it as poor time management. People might call it or talk about part of the element of it as time blindness, or many people have identified that time blindness is a problematic and ableist phrase. It references blindness, right, as a deficiency. So some people will call it time agnosia or time unawareness or whatever. And so I figured we'd start there talking about that, because it happens to me every day. If you ever talk to any of my clients, and of course you never could because you'd never know who they are, but they would all tell you, I'm supposed to run 50-minute sessions from the hour until 50 minutes after the hour. I don't do that. And I'm not claiming that it's like the right way to be done or that it doesn't cause problems. I'm saying that I struggle with ending at the 50-minute mark, that I keep going. I go late and then I start the next thing late. And I will often have 3-4 hours where I literally hang up one Zoom call and open the next, or say goodbye to a client that's here in person and then hop straight onto a Zoom call, or whatever the transition is. It's not great. I don't like it, but I do it for many reasons. And we can talk about that to start this off. Although again, anybody who says anything, bring it along, It's just interesting and unique today because I've never done that before the stream. I always set time aside to, take a step away, get something to drink, use the restroom, in large part because I'm terrified of what happens if I forget to do that, which we'll get to in a second, unless we get off on something else. And today I didn't. I was in a conversation, and it was important to me to have as much time in that conversation as I could, which is why I run my sessions long. It's not because I lose track of the time. I'm aware of what time it is. It's that there's something I'm trying to accomplish and I want to get it done. And even though it's eating into the time I would otherwise have, I think of that as a personal sacrifice. And yes, there's a lot of problems here, right? I'm making an assumption that the other person wants to continue to talk longer than we had scheduled, even though I'm okay with it, doesn't mean that they are. And that has blah, blah, blah. We don't need to go down every rabbit hole. But yeah, it's unusual. Usually I even do vocal warm-ups before the stream. For the past 2 or 3 weeks, I think, have been doing this by myself. I don't remember. And I think once earlier than that. And otherwise, I've always had people with me. I prefer to have people here, but I have not been doing a good job of inviting people and talking to people and setting things up with enough notice so that people can join me. This is not the way I prefer to do it. It's the way that it happens because I was not able to, with whatever efforts I did, set it up the other way. Of course, I don't mind doing it this way. I do like to talk. It's a weird thing about me. So let's talk about this a little bit, because one element of this that doesn't get discussed a lot that I think is very important is a concept we call interoception. Interoception is the sense of the body's internal state that we have, not in an emotional or in a cognitive sense where it's about what we might call metacognition, observing one's own cognitive experience, but literal physical sensory stimuli just that originates within the body. So as an example, we have nerve endings on our bladder that tell us how full or empty the bladder is. Same on the stomach. We have the vestibular sense involving stuff in the ears, the vestibular, equipment in the ears that tell us what is our relationship to gravity at the moment, et cetera, et cetera. So there's physical stimuli that originates in the body. So it's internal, but it's observable. Theoretically, if someone had the ability to monitor, like see what our bladder looks like, they would be able to corroborate that data that we're picking up. Of course, the problem then becomes, as with all perception, we don't really, truly always know. It's never exactly correct, right? So yeah, it is possible that sometimes we think we need to use the restroom when we don't, or that we don't when we do. And we can't really check that very easily. There's not a lot of reality checking involved. So different people prioritize different things in attention. And some of this we impact consciously and intentionally, and some of it we don't. But some of us, many of us, especially people who have ADHD diagnoses, but neurodivergent people generally speaking, seem to have, for whatever reason, deprioritized interoception, meaning that we are less likely to be aware of the data that's originating inside of our bodies. That it's there, and we can know, we do, you will eventually, sooner or later, feel hunger or thirst or the need to urinate or whatever. But that it might be that stuff has to become a lot more urgent before you even notice it in the first place. It is also possible that what you notice, depending on how things go over the pattern of your life and doing things over and over again, that your ability to interpret those signals is not always the strongest, right? That whatever that you are aware of the data, it is coming in, but that the interpretation you get of that is not directly proportionate to what is actually happening. Feeling energized when you're actually very tired, or feeling tired when you're actually very energized, is an example of that. Of course, that's a more vague one. What does energized mean exactly? But it does rely on physical senses, right? On some level, we experience something and then we apply words and language to that thing in order to be able to remember it and define it and describe it to other people, communicate about it. So I'll talk about myself because nobody's talking in the chat yet. That interoception, when it is, for whatever reason, seems to be routinely deprioritized, I don't notice it very much. Means that I will go long stretches of time. If I am busy and engaged in something, I just forget to eat. For example, disordered eating, as opposed to an eating disorder, by the way, that's important. Disordered eating is very common in people with ADHD, or again, neurodivergent people, generally speaking. And I'm going to, for the rest of this, probably just refer to neurodivergent people because I think there's limited utility in focusing on one particular group of people that would refer to themselves as neurodivergent versus another particular group. If the things that we are talking about seem relevant and helpful and useful, then they're relevant and helpful and useful. We don't have to distinguish which group of people they might be helpful for. They're helpful for you or they're not. And this is that point that I mentioned where I'm going to grab my decanter from over here and refill my water, because already I can tell I don't have a sense of thirst, or at least I don't know what people might mean when they say they're thirsty, but I can tell that my mouth is very dry. I'm getting the physical stimuli of my cheeks and lips and teeth and tongue sticking to each other in ways that I don't like. I can hear the clicking in my voice. That's what I utilize in order to determine when it's time for me to drink. I honestly don't know if that's what other people mean when they say they're thirsty. I know some people do and some people don't. I don't know what the general idea of thirst is. And hunger is similar. Again, I'm using myself as an example right now, but it wasn't until very recently that I realized that for me, hunger has nothing to do with how much is in my stomach or not. Like I said, if I'm engaged in a task, I will go an entire day without eating. There have been many, many, many days in my life where I ate once, sometimes one big meal, sometimes just a quick little thing. Other times when I'm understimulated, I'll feel hungry no matter what. And I will often, when eating, not know how to stop. That when I stop eating is based on one of two things. Either because it starts to hurt and feel uncomfortable, which seems to me to not be the way that it's intended, but maybe that's it for everybody. Certainly it's it for some other people that I know. Or based on a cognitive idea I have of what seems to be about the appropriate amount for a person to eat. For me, when I say hungry, which is a thing I've been saying my entire life, right? It's a word I've been using my entire life. What I've meant is I want to eat. And whether it's I want to eat because that thing looks delicious to me and I want to eat it, or whether it's I want to eat because I'm understimulated and I just need something kind of tactile and crunchy, something to snack one piece on while I'm watching TV that's not fully occupying me. Whether it's I want to eat because my stomach is completely empty and I am aware of it, doesn't really matter. It's all hunger to me. And yeah, that also means that I don't stop until I have an idea that I should, which in many cases is based off of what I think other people around me are thinking about how much I've eaten. But sometimes it's more abstract in terms of calories or really just how many different things. Could be anything. There are a lot of people like that. And honestly, with this and with a lot of these things, we generally, we as a society, as a species, we don't have good data on prevalence rates on things like this, because that's all filtered through diagnosis, which we've talked about in the past and we can talk about again whenever. But even more particularly, I don't have any idea of how common certain things are or are not. There's a particular cognitive bias we call availability bias, which cognitive biases are typically discussed in the ways in which they cause problems as opposed to the mechanisms that necessitate them. That's a really it's precise. It means exactly what I mean it to mean, but I don't know how easily understood that way of saying it is. So let me say it this way. Availability bias is the idea that what information is available to us is what information is important, right? That's the mistake. That's the bias, the cognitive bias. The mistake that we make is the information I have is the information that's relevant, right? And we talk about it in those terms. But there's the element that we don't often look at of why does it happen, as opposed to just this is what happens. And this is a problem when discussing consciousness and the mind and mental health and all this stuff across the board, is what exactly do we mean? How exactly do we measure it? And so people tend to just, like, how many times have you heard somebody say psychology says blah, 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 blah. Psychology doesn't say anything. That's just an idea that somebody ran some research study, or maybe not, maybe just logically, concluded or put some concept out there that resonated with somebody, maybe a lot of people. And so we then say, okay, this is how the brain works because that's what we've observed. We have these cognitive biases, we observe them. We don't often spend as much time talking about the mechanisms underneath all that. But here's the mechanism of availability bias. Of course, we utilize the information we have access to more than the information we don't. How would you utilize information that you don't have access to? So it's important to remember that there is information out there that I don't have access to, or at least that there's potentially information out there that I don't have access to. And what we talk about in terms of the cognitive bias is when people forget that part, when we lose track of the idea that what we're doing is the way we're doing it because it's necessary, because it's the only option, not because it's optimal or because it's correct. People confuse what happens with what they think should happen. In availability bias, they confuse what I know with what I should know. I assume that what I know is what I should know. So in this particular instance, availability bias is impacting my ability to talk about prevalence rates and things like that, because what do I know and what do I see? Myself, primarily, as all of us do. That's our primary source of knowledge about people and how they work, is by observing ourselves. And then secondarily, the people with whom I'm the closest, right? And then in descending order, the person other than myself of whom I am most aware is going to be the person that I base my thoughts about what humans are like off of, more than any other person except myself, and then the next and the next and the next. And the people that are around me are neurodivergent people, because that's what we do. We call it, well, one particular application of this we call assortative mating, meaning that people seek out partners, end up with partners who match them in some way. So we're self-sorting ourselves in a sense. And of course, there are different theories about all of these things. But yeah, we tend to find other people who are similar to us, call it neurodivergent or not. It doesn't matter what trait or what characteristic you're talking about. Anything that is true about you is probably disproportionately true about the people with whom you are closest than it is to the population as a whole, if that makes sense. So I don't know how much of this is universal, how much of it is, specifically unique and weird, but it just so happens that a lot of the people I know tend to be weird in that way, which again, I think is definitely true. What generally I'll say is that all of these things that I talk about, I believe are universal experiences. The difference between one person and the next is not, does it occur, yes or no, but how frequently does it occur? How intense is it? How problematic is it? What impact does it have on your life? What is it that you're trying to do? And what are the contexts in which you're trying to do those things? Well, that stuff is going to dictate at least part of the impact that whatever experience you're having has on what you're doing. So yes, we vary. But I would say I am sure that I believe that it is a universal experience that people will, for example, feel hungry and that they want to eat, but then get distracted by something, get into something, and are not able to eat for some whatever reason, but then focus on other things and lose track of that hunger interoception data. And then later on, it comes back, and now it's worse because, of course, all that time has passed in the interim. Interoception is, to me, and a lot of the things that I talk about, I assume other people talk about, but I don't know specifically. So I would never want to say, oh, this is just me thinking this, because I'm sure other people talk about it. I can't claim to have read everything that everybody's ever written on all this stuff, right? But to me, interoception is potentially the most important and most overlooked piece when we're talking about managing time. In particular, because time is a construct, right? It's a thing, there's an experience that we have that is defined or understood through the lens of this construct of time that we've created, and whatever, it gets complicated. But we have invented external methods of measuring time. We have not universal necessarily, but nigh universal terminology for different increments of time and agreed upon ways of measuring those things, etc. Meaning most of us have clocks and use a 24-hour day and 12 hours of AM and 12 hours of PM and time zones, and et cetera, et cetera. And all these things are constructs. We've made them up. Construct doesn't mean it's invalid or that it's wrong or incorrect. It just means we've made it up. It's useful, it's valid, it's helpful, but it's something we've constructed, right? So that an hour is 60 minutes and a minute is 60 seconds. That's something that we as humans constructed, that idea. It's a useful one. But people often will rely more on those external markers, those constructs of time, as opposed to the internal ones, because we have internal ones too. regardless of the construct of what an hour is or what a minute is or how long a day is. As time passes, you will get hungry, you will get tired, you will need to use the bathroom sooner or later. Your heart will continue to beat at some kind of a rate, and it's variable, but it's consistent, right? So we do have internal markers of time that don't rely on the construct. A lot of the time when people are struggling with what we generally will call time management is because they're using time as the construct, prioritizing that data over time as an interoceptive experience. I'm getting super weird and philosophical. And honestly, it's only going to get weirder and more abstract and philosophical from here, probably, unless and until somebody says something in chat. So, if you like it, cool. If not, say something. And even if you like it, say something anyway, so I don't feel alone here. This concept, the idea that some people approach things through the lens of the construct, through our cognition, that is technically or theoretically approachable through observation as opposed to cognition, basically meaning we are thinking about things sometimes that we don't need to think about. There are other things, there are other ways to approach those. And we're approaching it cognitively. That's really helpful sometimes. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it. We wouldn't even have the ability to do it as people if it wasn't beneficial to us, right? But it's also really harmful sometimes. Depending on what you're trying to do and the context in which you are trying to do it, it is situationally advantageous or disadvantageous, just like everything we talk about when we talk about neurodiversity, or really just human experience generally. We've talked about neurodiversity a lot here, and I've tried to be very clear about the fact that I find the most value in that term and in that paradigm as, sorry, I just got a message and it totally distracted me. That to me, the greater value in the neurodiversity paradigm is not as a new way to categorize people, as some people are neurodivergent and some are not, but as a lens through which to look at all people and all variation, that differences in anybody are situationally advantageous or disadvantageous, even pathological ones, but that's a little outside of my scope anyway. So thinking about things is beneficial in some contexts and harmful in others. And there are pretty popular concepts about this, pop culture kind of concepts. If anybody's aware of the concepts of the yips, or a term that I just learned this past summer, I don't even remember when the Olympics were, the twisties, when Simone Biles, US gymnast, I hope I'm remembering this correctly, who is generally widely considered to not only be the best, but so much the best that it's like not even a competition for certain things that she got involved in. I want to say the vault. And she went to the competition, did the vault, and messed it up somehow, and then withdrew from the competition and said that she got the twisties, which apparently is a term in gymnastics that means I started to become aware of the position of my body in the air. I was thinking about where I was and trying to think about how many turns I'd made as opposed to just doing it. And it messed me up. And that it's a very dangerous thing. The yips people talk about a lot in baseball, but it goes into a lot of sports psychology, is, the person who shoots free throws all the time and all of a sudden can't. The second baseman who throws to first base all the time and all of a sudden can't. And part of the reason we talk about these things is because they escalate, because the problem occurs and then we try to fix it, but every attempt to fix it actually makes it worse. Outside of the context of sports psychology, think about any experience you've ever had where you say, what do I do with my hands, right? How do I normally use my hands? As soon as you start to think about it, it's impossible to know, because what happens normally is that we don't think about it. So when we think about a thing that we don't usually think about, it causes problems. We're looking at it in a different way, or at least it can cause problems. And a lot of what we talk about in the neurodivergent experience, so just as a thing, when I say neurodiversity, I'm usually referring to the paradigm. When I say neurodivergent, I'm referring to what many people think of when they talk about neurodiversity, which is the idea that some people are neurodivergent and some people are not. I I find that to be a very useful construct, even though I don't think it is a completely accurate one, if that makes sense. There are certain differences in people's experiences that are worth lumping together in certain ways, and neurodivergent is a great term to talk about those things. So just like a little key there in a sense. That a lot of the time what we're talking about in the neurodivergent experience is trying to approach things where cognition isn't necessarily helpful with cognition. We're trying to think our way through problems that don't really get resolved by thinking. They get resolved by observing, doing, interacting, moving, as opposed to thinking. And those are two different things. And we have finite resources. So everything you spend on one doesn't get spent on the other. That when you are thinking, whatever it is that you are spending on that thinking, whatever energy, whatever cognitive resources, is not being spent on something else. People, well, I was going to get off on a little other tangent there, but maybe it's helpful. I don't know. Put it in chat if you want to talk about what people's misconceptions sometimes are in this realm. So time management is something that the truth is, no matter how much you struggle with it, we all do it to some extent. You can't survive without it. You must at some points go to sleep because time has passed and you feel tired, if nothing else, and eat and drink and use the restroom and whatever. But we have different levels of sensitivity to those things. And yeah, that causes problems. And partly because we don't have good language for it, and partly because a lot of these things are not considered polite to discuss, especially when it comes to the bathroom issue side of things, waste elimination. Even right now, I don't know what terminology to use that people will be comfortable with, that a lot of it doesn't get talked about. There's even correlations in terms of asexuality or demisexuality and neurodivergence and things like that. That for some people, if this is just a construct through which to look at this stuff, like all the others, right? But one way that is potentially helpful to look at these things is to say that thinking about a thing, thinking about anything, being aware of things that could be, might be, no matter how accurate, no matter how useful, no matter how correct, is different from observing what is, interacting with what is. And so the more you do of one, the less you do of the other. And when you create that construct, it's not perfect because none of them are, but it enables you to look at certain things differently. And time management is one of those things. Time management, yeah, it's useful to have clocks. Primarily, it's useful for communication purposes, right? That I can say a time and have confidence that if I say, hey, we're going to do this stream at 1 p.m. Central Time on Wednesdays, that everybody who hears me is going to know what that means without me having to go into further detail. If we didn't have the times and the time zones and the clocks, it would be a lot harder to make any plans between one person and another person, or more than two people, that involve the future in any way. But it's not always super helpful in terms of noticing the passage of time, which is something that this is a theory that I think people primarily use interoception to do. So there are workarounds, and we talk about that stuff all the time, like get a big clock and put it in front of you so that you see it. And yeah, that makes it easier to be aware of the passage of time. But it's still theoretical, meaning your concept of time is theoretical. It's not grounded in the reality, the lived experience of what's happening over that time. It's a mental, cognitive construct of the passage of time. So there are ways to approach it. And yeah, I'll get back practical and talk about time management. Yeah, put clocks in front of you, and really anything, well, really, as with any topic we discuss, if you know any sensitivities of yours, sensory or otherwise, any category of data that your brain seems to prioritize, use that. If you are visually more, if you prioritize visual data, visually sensitive, then yeah, a big clock, or as a lot of time people will recommend things like an hourglass, which I do like hourglass, because as opposed to a clock, which only tells you the present state, an hourglass gives you a visual of how much time has passed since you started it and how much is left before it runs out, visually rather than cognitively. But also people who are prioritizing tactile data, you can utilize that. You can get a smartwatch that you set to buzz at you every 10 minutes, or hell, even every minute, or whatever, that you can set. I am very auditorily, I prioritize auditory data. When 10 minutes before anything I put into my calendar, my phone yells at me. It's Navi's voice from the Ocarina of Time, and it's probably been heard on this stream going, hey, listen, because I will not miss that. The default auditory notification noise on my calendar, I would tune out, just not notice it. Even though my ears would pick up the sense, my brain wouldn't always permit that into awareness, wouldn't always pay attention. This one, I notice, right? So we can utilize things like that. But there's an entirely other approach to it too, which is to find ways to engage with it in non-cognitive ways, in observational ways. If interoception is deprioritized, first of all, there are things that we could try to do that theoretically for a given individual may increase how much they prioritize interoception. We can train people to notice things more, because we can train anybody to notice anything more if we use operant conditioning techniques and all that kind of stuff. But again, I always would like to lean into what you already pay attention to. What do I pay attention to? Social data. That overrides most everything that I encounter in my daily life. Obviously, there's tons of hypothetical things that my brain would prioritize over social data, but those things don't really happen that much in my life. So what I actually do, this isn't conscious or intentional, it's observational, but once you observe it, then you can play around with it. What I actually do is I watch other people. I know I was with people last night and I had no concept of what time it was until one of them started getting anxious about wherever they needed to be next. That the thing I was doing right before this, the conversation I was having right before this, I know it's over because the other person was the one that was anxious about me getting to the stream at 1 o'clock. I might have been late if they hadn't done it in that way. And it's part of the reason that I often run over, because I'm talking to somebody and I can read in them that they want to continue talking. And because I prioritize that data way more than I prioritize interoceptive or cognitive data about time, I am much more likely to, even though I see the clock and I'm aware of the time and that I should theoretically go so that I can X, Y, or Z, well, I'm still basing my sense of time around the people, or off of the people around me, more than anything else. And again, a lot of us do that. I think especially people who identify as neurodivergent, but as before, talking about prevalence, I can't say for certain or not. This is the part I hate the least about doing this by myself, is that usually when I take a sip of water, somebody else like fills the gap, and instead it's just silent while I drink. I don't like leaving that gap for people. So once you observe that, once you know that, then you can start to play with it. And yeah, part of that I do, it's not a trick, it's not a secret. Part of that I do by just doing what I'm doing now. I tell people, hey, I'm not so great at noticing what time it is or when we should be wrapping up. So just be aware that if you think that I'm wanting us to go past the time, it's probably more likely that I just think you want to keep talking and don't even know what time it is. So giving people heads up like that. Sometimes it's a matter of I have to say it out loud because that makes it part of the social interaction. If I say, hey, I have to go by X time, now they're aware of it and I will be more aware of it because they're aware of it. Even if they aren't actually aware of it, I will be more likely to think that they are aware of it. All of this comes back to authenticity. We talk about that all the time. And it's important to me, although maybe it's not important to anybody else, but it's important to me to be clear that the things that I talk about, the things that I think are important or helpful or useful, I base that on what I think is useful, what I think is helpful, what I think is important, not what I think is correct or desirable or what should be happening. I base it off of my best ability to determine what is happening. And of course, my ability is limited just as anybody else's is. But authenticity is not something I talk about because I think it's a nice idea to be authentic with people. I define it very specifically, and I have a chain of logic that I can connect to why it does the things that we talk about it doing, which, by the way, is another very common thing among neurodivergent people, is wanting to be able to connect every dot instead of just accepting conclusions with parts in the middle that are missing. It's a very common thing for neurodivergent people to say, why? And this is not, I didn't intend to talk about this, but since it came up, just a quick note here. Why in particular is a very tricky question, because if I want more information, if I genuinely, earnestly want more information about someone's reasoning behind what they're asking me to do or what they're doing, how do I get that information other than saying, why do you want me to do that? Or why are you doing that, right? I can phrase it differently, and I do all the time. Obviously, we all do this. What's your reasoning behind this, et cetera, et cetera. But because of other cognitive biases, people tend to respond to a question of why or what's your reasoning or what's the point as a challenge. Not that it's a genuine and earnest request for more information, but that it is a statement that I disagree. I don't think that what you're doing is good, or I don't think that what you're asking me to do is good or necessary. So by saying why, what I'm trying to do is make you realize that you don't actually know, or make you give me a reason that I can then argue against. People have a tendency to respond to the question of why as though it is disrespectful, as though it's a challenge. Because sometimes it is. Sometimes somebody says, hey, do this thing. You're like, why? And it is a challenge. It literally, in many cases, just means like, no, I don't think that's a good idea. I'm open to maybe doing it if you can help me understand that it's important, but unless you tell me something that I don't know, don't think that that is good or helpful or necessary to do. But we want to know why a lot. I said it was going to be a quick diversion. It turned out to not be quick. I don't really do things quickly in that way. Authenticity to me is this. If you talk to people who focus on cognition, mind philosophy or metaphysical philosophy, people who ask questions about what it means to be conscious, what the mind is, et cetera, which obviously I am a very big fan of. Generally speaking, of course, there's always debate about everything, but generally speaking, people are fairly comfortable saying that by the time something arrives in consciousness, it has been already constructed a bit before it gets there. Meaning, if I think a thing, if you think a thing, we can have lots of stories and theories about why we think that thing, although we can never actually know because we can't observe the construction of the thought. If I say, what are you thinking? And you say X, Y, and Z, and I say, okay, well, what does that mean? You can talk more about X, Y, or Z. You can't talk about what it means to think a thing. Go ahead and try to define to somebody what the experience of thinking is in some way that involves breaking it down into smaller component pieces, something that isn't just descriptive or evocative, right? And again, I don't know exactly how broad the consensus is, but generally speaking, or at least what I'm aware of is that it is often broken down into three pieces, that if we're going to break down a cognate, a thought, a thing that you are aware of, conscious of in your head, that we can break it down to three things that none of which can be reduced further. One is cognition. It's a thought. I have a thought. One is affect. It's a feeling. I have a feeling. I don't know what the mechanism of a feeling is. I can describe the feeling, but I can't describe what it means to feel the feeling, right? And then the third is volition, which is desire, what I want. Really, it's evaluative, right? It's what I like or don't like. But when applied to something that isn't current, it's about what do I want? What will I like it or not like it? So affect, cognition, and volition. So when I talk about authenticity, first of all, I define it clearly as two things. Number one, everything I say as accurately as I am able to do. And it's important to me that I phrase it that way and not as I only tell the truth or I never lie. Because aside from the obvious that a lot of people would say is, what about when you earnestly believe something to be the truth but are mistaken? There's that. But also that even if I'm quote unquote not mistaken, well, quote unquote, I don't know. Even if I'm not mistaken, even if what I'm saying is accurate, I cannot none of us can accurately predict how every other person will interpret what it is I'm communicating. Even if theoretically everything I said was a perfectly accurate, completely complete, which is not possible, but a complete description of whatever it is I'm trying to talk about, other people still aren't going to interpret it the way I intend. So I can't really communicate truth, even if I knew it and was able to articulate it for myself. I can't articulate it to someone else. Beyond that, we can't even articulate it to ourselves because it is limited, right? That whatever I say, no matter how accurate, my name is Brandon Tesser's perfectly accurate statement, it just relies on so many other assumptions because that's what language is. So this is not a problem. I'm just trying to be precise. Step number one is I say things as accurately as I am able to say them. Everything I say as accurately as I'm able to say it. And the other half of authenticity is I share everything that I am observing or experiencing internally that I have any reason to believe might be relevant to the person I'm talking to. Meaning, if I'm scared and somehow that might be relevant to you, even if I don't know how, even if I'm not sure that it necessarily is, I just think it might be, then I got to tell you that I'm scared. If I am distracted, I got to tell you I'm distracted. And therapists generally, really anybody in power positions, and therapists generally are in power positions, tend to be terrified of that second piece. It's really like very hotly debated in the world of therapy or psychoanalysis, psychology, whatever you want to call it. Some people are very dedicated to the idea that the therapist should not really be an entity in that room, that they should be a blank slate on which the client can just project whatever they need to project, and that anything you do or say that makes you more of a real person in the client's mind is harmful to the process. Other people, and I'm more in line with this kind of thinking, will say that that's ridiculous because we are people and nobody forgets that we are people. And no matter how much I share about who I am and what I'm doing and whatever, there's still plenty of blank slate for people to project on. They might project particular concepts of something. If I say, for example, that I like video games, they might now particularly project things that they think about people who like video games. Whereas if I hadn't said that, they could have projected whatever they wanted. But even that's not true. You have a physical appearance that's going to dictate what things people project onto you. I don't even super like the concept of projection. But yeah, that authenticity is the best thing that I can do. And I'll tell you, it's not easy. It's really not, because we make predictions about how people will respond to the things that we do and say. And when you think a thing, and your prediction about how somebody else will respond to that thing is not something that you want, it's very difficult to remind yourself that it's still a prediction and you don't actually know how that other person will respond. And that even if you are correct and it is the thing that you don't want, is it really your choice? Is it really, are you respecting that person's autonomy if you withhold the information from them because of how you think they might react, even if you're correct when it happens? That because of I don't like of what I think how you'll react, I therefore should not share a thing with you. To me, authenticity is purely about acknowledging our limitations. And so back where we started this, getting into authenticity, was talking about by the time a thought, a feeling, or a desire arrives in our consciousness, something constructed it. We don't know exactly what, because that's the whole point. Anything that takes place outside of our consciousness is something we can't observe. But something constructed it. So to me, the most useful way to think about it is that's my best guess, that my brain and my body, without conscious input, took all the data that they have access to, that I have access to. I'm saying they and I, it's all me, right? Took all the information from the environment, all the information I have access to in my memories, all the constructs, all the whatever, combined it all, and it resulted in this thought, and the thought is what I am conscious of. So one of my most important rules is do what you want unless you have reason to do otherwise. And I always add the quick addendum that that's not a rare thing. This is not a philosophy of, everybody should do whatever the hell they want and not worry about how it impacts other people. Because a large part of what I want, in fact, some people would argue that what all of us want is constructed based on our observations of people around us. And slowly that's a concept called mimesis, that the things that we want are really just what has filtered through our perception of what other people want or want for us or think we should want or whatever. I apologize, by the way. Someone, if the fidget I'm playing with today is a little clacky, if somebody's bothered by that, please put that in the chat and I will stop or switch to a different fidget. Yeah, that I constantly have reason to do other than whatever my impulse would be. It's not about it being rare. It's about where we put the burden of proof, as opposed to how many people go through life, because we train each other to do this, at least in this culture, where what I should do is what I should do, and I can do differently than that, but only if I can justify it. So I got to do what's right. I got to do what I'm supposed to do unless I can justify doing what I want, if what I want is different than what I'm supposed to do. It puts the burden of evidence on being able to explain, understand, recognize, observe why you want what you want. I like to shift the burden of proof to the other side, that I'm going to just assume that my brain and body came up with the best idea that I am literally capable of coming up with, and is now presenting it to consciousness so that I can now use reason to point out any flaws that impulse has. To say, yeah, that makes sense, but here's the problem, because if I do that now, what about later? Because that's something that really can only take place in consciousness, right? Imagining what isn't currently happening, but might, or could be happening currently elsewhere, or even remembering. Memory is a cognitive process. It can be accurate. It's still imperfect and limited. You don't remember everything. Actually, one of these days, maybe today, I don't know if I'll have time, we can do some fun experiments with memory so that people can observe a lot of this stuff personally. I can prompt things and you can see what happens. That's what cognition is for, is to identify what things that are not currently observable might be impacted and might be relevant, might be problematic, et cetera, et cetera. So we talk about that one of the relatively universal, predictable things about attentional processes is that we prioritize as humans negative data over positive data. That I don't remember I can eat from these 99 bushes, I remember I can't eat from these 5, right? And that particular example makes it seem as though it's logical because it's easier to remember the things that are problematic than it is to remember the things that were not problematic, because there's less of them. And that's true to an extent, but that's, again, another thing. But that's, I don't think, the reasoning behind it. The reasoning behind it is that's what consciousness is for, is to run scenarios and make checks and say, okay, this is my impulse. Now let's check what would happen. Let me play it out and see if I do that. So yeah, all the time we're going to have impulses, constantly, moment to moment, have impulses that we don't act on. But I want clarity about why I can't act on that impulse. I am not willing to accept just because. I mean, think about it this way, right? We talk about it, we talk to children this way, and we were all children and we were talked to this way. But imagine right now, if you're an adult or a teen or whatever, imagine that somebody asked you to do something that you did not want to do, that you found to be unenjoyable and pointless. Because we do unenjoyable things all the time if we think that there's a point to it. But they ask you to do something unenjoyable and pointless. I want you to dig a 5-foot pit into your yard using a teaspoon. Well, A, we're not going to want to do it. B, we are going to want to do it because the other person asked us to, and humans are built that way, that we would default to doing. We assume that other people have reasons for asking us to do what they do. So then we say why? Because as opposed to just saying, no, I'm not going to do that, which is what I would do if I had absolutely no desire to do it whatsoever. No, I know that I don't want to do it. Why would I ask why? I'm saying I might and I might not. Tell me why you want me to, and then maybe I'll understand better about whether I will or won't. And imagine that the person gives you the answer of because I said so, because I know what's best for you, just because, don't worry about it. Why are you questioning me? Right? Imagine what that would feel like and whether or not you would be willing to do it anyway. Probably not. And if it was important to them that you do it, but they don't have an answer to your question, they don't know why it's important, they're just doing it because somebody else told them it was important and they don't know the reasoning behind that, well, then they can still get you to do it. And we do this all the time through operant conditioning, through offering rewards and threatening punishments. But it doesn't provide any answer as to why. Why the request was initially proposed. It just gives you an answer to why in terms of, well, because if I don't, I will get punished. Or if I do, I will get rewarded. Which, trust and safety has a big implication there. You don't respond to everybody's threats of punishment or promises of reward the same way. But yeah, we tell kids that all the time. And importantly, what I'm trying to talk about here is we tell ourselves that all the time. All the time. What am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to do this. And then if you ever ask why, oftentimes on the things that you're struggling the most with, oftentimes the answer will come back because that's what I'm supposed to do, because that's what people do, because that's what you do, that's what you have to do. That I guess that, this is an easier thing to talk about in the abstract because we can all picture things that, think of things that don't make sense. But let me put something out that quite likely many of you do believe is something that we should do, but don't actually have an answer for it. Should we shower every day? Do children have to go to school? Do we need to work? I'm not saying that the answer to any of these things is yes or no. I'm just saying, what is your answer? If your answer is, yes, of course we have to do that, then the next question is, why? And some of these questions we're not going to be able to answer. And some of you might even be getting a little defensive about the fact that I'm suggesting that there needs to be an answer beyond that. Just because it's gross if you don't shower every day, or because kids need to learn, because they need to go to school, because they won't be successful if they don't. There are answers. We wouldn't devise these things if there weren't answers. Whether those answers are ones that you agree with or are relevant to you or are not, whether they're accurate or not, that's questionable, but there are answers there. There are people that can give answers to those questions, or these things wouldn't exist. But it's important to know when you have an answer to it or when you don't. So do whatever you have the impulse to do, unless you have a reason to do otherwise. And when it comes to authenticity, that's what I'm saying is I say what my consciousness has in it. I present that to the other person unless I have a reason not to. And I do that all the time. Partly a default reason that exists at all times is that time matters and I can only say one thing at a time. So if I'm thinking three things, I have to pick whichever one I'm going to say and say it. But by the way, how many of us, and certainly me too, but how many of us struggle with the idea, oh, there's so many things in my head and I don't know which to say first, so I don't say anything. Because again, we're trying to find the right thing to say first, as opposed to just giving what is there. What am I supposed to do? Instead of what's my impulse? So we talk authentically because all the way back to me saying a thing that many therapists will struggle with, that I've struggled with in the past, is if I am bored in a session, saying I'm bored, because we feel as though that is not something we're supposed to experience, or that if we do, we should hide it from the client because it's a deficiency of ours and it's unhelpful to the client. And that is possible. There are times when that would be harmful to a client to say that you're bored in meeting with them. And there are times when it will be helpful. There are people that don't have an awareness of the fact that they are engaging with you in some way that you are finding boring. They don't know it, they can't anticipate it, and they're not reading it in you. And if you don't say it explicitly, they won't know. And if that's happening in a session, in a therapy session, it's happening elsewhere too. And part of what's important about therapy, or whatever version of this that you're talking about, is that it is a safe place to be authentic to say things like that so that people can learn and develop skills. Because you know what happens when somebody's worried that they might be boring someone but isn't sure if they are or not? That if you never ever tell me that you're bored when you're interacting with me, I can assume that means that you're never bored. I can also assume that it means that when you are bored, you don't tell me. And some people will make the first assumption, some people will make the second assumption. And many people who make that second assumption will then just start defaulting to, people are always bored of me, but no one will ever tell me. I am just assuming that I'm always boring. That in a moment, if I say I'm bored, that is helpful, potentially. Does that mean every time I feel boredom, I say I'm bored right now? No, of course not. If I have something else to say, if I have some reason to say something else, or not say that. But I don't withhold it and throw it away completely just because that's not what you're supposed to do, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's the mechanism behind why I think authenticity is important, because it's the best idea I have. Once cognition gets involved, once I start thinking about what do I normally do with my hands, once I start thinking about how much time has passed and how much time do I have left and how much time do I need, I lose elements of whatever the thing is, because it involves so much data that I cannot fit it all into comprehension, into cognition, into consciousness. We can't be aware of it all. We're aware of it through language. Even if you're not using language in terms of, a language that you share with other people, but in terms of what we call semiotics, that you have symbols and signs of things, that you compress that data into something so that it can get into cognition, but that removes some of the information. No matter what, no matter how accurate a memory is, for example, it is not containing everything that was there in the physical environment at the time. Because you didn't even notice everything, first of all, and you don't remember everything you did notice. And now I want to do that memory thing, but we only have 3 minutes left, and that's not a good time for it. And I might have done it already. I'm not even sure. So yeah, we come back to authenticity, which then the next thing is communication. If I'm being authentic, great, except that if there's nobody else around to be impacted by that authenticity and to respond to me, and who also feels safe being authentic and is observing themselves and willing and able to put things out in return, when that happens, when they are able and willing to do all those things, then we build things together, right? We figure things out together. Sometimes helpful and sometimes unhelpful things, but we figure things out. But why? VarkTech. I don't know what that VarkTech means. I don't know if it means something, tell me, because I don't know what it means. But why? What do you mean, but why? What's the question? Why what? Or were you just doing a callback to why? Why do we as humans operate this way? Why does it work? A weird concept to throw out. I'm just guessing because this person hasn't qualified what they meant by why, which, by the way, just demonstrating what this process looks like, not intentionally, but that's just how I just tuned in and hear say why 1,000 times. Yeah. Because that's what consciousness is. It's why. I mean, we're getting real philosophical. Like I said, I was going to be philosophical today if people don't put out other things to get me in other directions. Because we do narratives, because we connect things in sequence. This connects to that, connects to this, connects to that. And that connection, is not real. It's not in the physical environment. Doesn't mean it's not valid or accurate or helpful. They hopefully usually are. But that's what we do. That's what makes you real philosophical. What makes you you? What makes it so that you, who you are right now, is the same person as you were 10 years ago? None of the cells in your body are the same. You don't look the same. You don't feel the same. You don't behave the same, think the same, feel the same. There are similarities and connections, but nothing's the same. So what makes you the same? Because we have a connection. We have it structured so that who we were and who we are is the same being, even though it is different in material ways, right? So that's why I'm talking about why today. It was very philosophical today. But I'm putting it out there because it's authentic, because it's what I'm thinking about. I had somebody right before this ask, why do you want to do this thing? And my answer, the truthful answer, is because I want to. I don't know. That's just how it is. I can come up with theories once I observe that I want to. Once I observe that I like it, then I can come up with theories and stories about why I might like it or what I think about it. And those theories and stories can be accurate and useful, but they're still after the fact justifications of just, I like it. I'm talking about these things today because it's what comes out. It's what's in my head. And when I need to talk for an hour and I'm trying to be helpful, I might think a little bit about what thing to say, but then I start saying things and it leads to the next and the next. That's what I mean about putting things in chat. We impact each other, right? So it's important to me to always be able to justify to myself, whether or not somebody else agrees with it, understand for myself why I'm doing what I'm doing, even though that logic is limited by my ability to be logical, right? By my awareness of things, but we're getting pretty recursive here at the end. Practically speaking, because we're going to wrap up here, it comes back to this. What we're intended to do, what we're constructed to do, the ways that our brain and body works, and some of that, most of that we just can't observe or really see, but we come up with theories and ideas about it that seem to describe what we experience. But what we're meant to do is observe, take data in from observing it, whether that's observing the external environment, observing interoception, physical data from within ourselves, metacognition, observing our own cognition. We observe, we take data in through attention into awareness. And then in awareness, we just play around with that data. Some of it we code, or actually sometimes don't code, but process into long-term memory. Sometimes we retrieve other things out of long-term memory because of whatever's in awareness. We play around with it, we think, until we come up with some idea, something to say, do, whatever. And then we execute the idea. And we observe what happens when we execute it, and we observe what happens afterward. And that's new data. And then we think. It should be constantly happening in that way. We think, we act, we observe. We observe, we think, we act. We act, we observe, we think. Whatever. It doesn't have a starting point. Or whatever the starting point is, I guess, happens when we're babies, and who the hell knows. But that's what it's meant to be. You think until you have an idea, then you test the idea so that you observe it. And a lot of us, neurodivergent or not, a lot of us, when we get stuck, it's because we are stuck on the thinking part, and we're not going to do anything about it until we are certain that the idea is good enough. And that's okay, again, right? Like, I'm not saying do any random impulsive thought that pops into your mind. We want to check and say, is this idea good enough? But it's good to check that process. Instead of just assuming, no, it's not good enough, get into it and say, well, how good would it have to be? What do I really mean here? What's the return on investment if I continue to try to think about it more without getting information? So here's a specific practical framework that I give to people sometimes. It's called the idea to beat. I assume that phrase is from some other place than where I know it from, but I know it from an episode of The Office. But it's helpful to me, and I've found it to be helpful for other people sometimes, is I think until I have an idea. Once I have an idea, I can justify, is it an idea to beat, or is it one that I throw away and don't have really an idea? And what makes it an idea to beat is 3 things. Number 1, am I capable of doing it? Is it actually a thing that I can act on? Do I have the knowledge, the resources, can I pay the cost it requires in order to do it? Yes or no? Number 2, do I have any reason to believe that there's at least a potential, a possibility, even if small, that doing this thing will either accomplish whatever I'm trying to accomplish, or get me more information that will enable me to come up with a better idea in order to work towards something else that will accomplish what I'm trying to accomplish? And 3, will this cause problems for myself or for others that I'm not willing to cause? And all of this is speculation and projection, and this is where things get glitched out. But if it causes problems, that goes back into the cost. Okay, let me look at these problems. Am I willing to pay the cost of taking the risk that problem occurs? Because it's not a certainty, but I think it's likely to some extent, maybe very unlikely, maybe very likely. So it loops them back to the beginning and affects the idea to be. But if I can do it, if I have reason to believe that it could potentially help me either in accomplishing the thing or getting closer to an idea that will accomplish the thing, and if it either does not cause harm or the risk of whatever harm it might cause that I'm aware of is part of a cost that I'm willing to pay, it's the idea to beat. Once you have the idea to beat, you do it unless you have two questions you can ask yourself. Number one, is there information out there, or do I at least I have reason to believe that there's information out there that would enable me to make a better idea than this? Even if I don't know whether it exists or not, or what it specifically might be, or where to find it, or whether I can, do I have reason to believe that it exists? If the answer to that is yes, start the process over. The new idea to beat is, how do I find that information? That's the problem that you're coming up with the new idea to beat for. If the answer to that is no, I have no reason to believe that there's information that will enable me to come up with a better idea out there, then the next question, and you can do these in either order. The next question is, other than putting the idea to beat into practice, testing it, other than that, is there anything else I can do that I might prefer to do that I believe has a reason, that I have reason to believe will give me new information, even if I don't know what that information is or might be, that will enable me to make a better idea? Either I need to think there's information out there and I don't know what to do to get it, or I need to know that there's something I can do that might get me information, even if I don't know what the information is. Those are the two questions. If the answer is no to both of those, then you do the idea to beat and you observe what happens and you iterate. If the answer to either or both of those questions is yes, if it's both, you pick which one you want to start with. If it's either, one but not the other, you restart the process with the new problem being, how do I get that information, or how do I do that thing that might get me information? But it comes back to the same idea to beat. Test it out. Because what I'm doing, like we say all the time, Cecil came up with this metaphor a long time ago, and I love it, that the ocean is a powerful, powerful force. If we observe what it does first, and then build on top of that, we can tap into that power and are capable of doing things that we would never otherwise be able to do. If we don't observe it first, but just decide what we want it to do or what we think it should do and build based on that, we might get lucky and it happens to work out that that's, how the ocean works, coincides with what we're trying to get done. Or we might get very unlucky and we are going in direct opposition to what it's trying to do, in which case it is still possible to do it, but it's going to be a hell of a lot harder because you're fighting against that power rather than utilizing it. Same thing here. The mind, if you observe yourself and build around that, you can tap into the power of whatever it is that it's doing. If you don't and just try and make it do what you think it should do, you might get lucky, you might get unlucky and be fighting against the power of your own mind. So for me, I'm neurodivergent. I think about things that people don't generally think about because they don't require cognition in order to be done. But I think about them. So my options are trying to get myself to stop thinking about them. That's not going to work. That's how I am. That's what happens. I tried not to think about it. It doesn't work. Try not to think about a purple elephant right now, right? Or understand that I think about it and lean into it and use that. And so that's what I've done. I define these words. I come up with these frameworks. I need to be able to use cognition to understand it all the way instead of just justify doing something that I don't really understand. And then I share them because some people find it helpful and some people probably find it ridiculous, and that's okay. As long as some people find it helpful, it's worth sharing. Honestly, as long as I believe that some people might find it helpful, it's worth sharing for me, whether or not that's true. I have a lot of evidence to support the probability that it is helpful for people. People tell me that, but ultimately it doesn't matter because we all filter it through that way. So take the idea to beat, think about interoception and time management, mostly observe yourself, see what happens, and then modify it where you need to modify it, but only by the bare minimum you need to in order to accomplish whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. Because whatever it is that you're doing, whatever it is that you're observing in yourself is not inherently problematic. It might cause problems. But a thing about you, a way of being, is not wrong. If it causes problems, we want to deal with that. We want to make whatever changes we need to make. But those changes might be not to the individual, but to the environment. Or it might just be in how to deal with the problems when they arise because we can't prevent them. Or it could be a million other things. There's no way of being that is inherently, in and of itself, wrong, even though it causes no problems for anybody. What would that be? So observe yourself, build around it. It's okay to want to be different. It's okay to work on it, and it can be done, but observe it first. Thank you all. Thanks for being here. I will see you next week. I plan on being here next week and every Wednesday. And this was fun. I'll talk to you later.